Hey guys, I've been trying to make a Remnant video since the game first came out, and it's been difficult to say the least. Every time I got close to actually making a video on a build, I found out some crazy new information that could make the build even stronger. And what's the point in uploading a video if it's not my best work? Welcome to my life, where nothing is good enough. But I think I've finally done it. The strongest, most unkillable Apocalypse build in the entire game. It works from melee, it works from ranged, it works even in multiplayer. In fact, it literally works better in multiplayer. You might be wondering how that's even possible. Get ready for some math. Also, big shout out to Vosh Kalwai, I don't know how to pronounce that. His videos gave me a lot of information that I needed to actually perfect this build, since it was only almost perfect without it. Let's start off simple and talk about a funny healing interaction. You might have seen videos online where people make themselves basically immortal by using the resonating heart. I've seen lots of people make videos on this, but one thing they all have in common is they're completely wrong in why it works in the first place. They put on relic effectiveness gear and assume that's why it works and then call it a day. Most of them accidentally stumble on the answer without realizing it. Turns out, you don't need any rings, amulets, traits, or fragments at all to make the insane healing happen. Crazy, right? See, Medic has a very unique perk that creates this kind of interaction. That perk is Benevolence. What? Yeah, so unlike other shared healing sources like Burden of the Divine, Benevolence actually counts as healing from the relic itself instead of just some unlabeled shared healing. Don't ask me why. This means that it interacts with the Resonating Heart's main ability. When you get overhealth supplied over the next 20 seconds, you're not just getting your own overhealth, you're getting the overhealth of everyone in the party that was close enough to be affected by the Benevolence perk, including your summons, including your allies, and including the summons of your allies. All mashed up together to make the healing you get over the next 20 seconds. So you don't actually need anything else whatsoever to make this infinite healing setup work. All you actually need is to have at least one summon near you, and you'll be fine. In this case, your best two options are the Reaver summon or the Handler dog. Handler dog might be better in multiplayer since it can revive you if you somehow die. But for solo, you definitely want Reaver because it makes this easier to do infinitely. All we need to do from there is be as bulky as we possibly can. So with that said, here's the actual loadout I have in mind. I'll talk about why we're using everything in a bit, but for now let's just go over the gear itself. For armor, you want full Lido Mark II except for the Labyrinth gloves, as that gives slightly more armor, but there's nothing wrong with doing full Lido either. For Relic, you want Resonating Heart, obviously, with the fragments being damage resist, health, and shield amount. For your Amulet, you want the Twisted Idol. For your rings, you want the Seal of the Empress, Ring of Robust, Re-Rallying Cable, and Drakestone Pearl. Your ranged weapons don't matter, but you do want the Song of Aether on one of them. On melee, you definitely want World's Edge, though technically speaking, lots of things can go here if you don't care about range. In fact, you can make a slightly different variant of this build that uses the Flail, which has way more DPS but lacks the range and some of the survivability. The Mutator you want on this one is definitely Steadfast regardless of which melee weapon you're using. Your traits are going to be Triage and Regrowth, as those come with the archetypes. Then you want Fortify, Vigor, Bark Skin, Blood Bond, and Rugged. Then you want 7 points in Recovery. Now, you do have 10 points left over, which I would recommend putting in Resonance if you have it. But I don't have Resonance, so I'm going to do Arcane Strike instead. Resonance makes us slightly more consistent in multiplayer since that's what the range of Benevolence scales off of, but it's not really required. For skills, you want Healing Shield and Reaver, though you might want to switch the Medic skill to Redemption in multiplayer. Last but not least, you always want a Bark Extract Concoction active. Your final armor total should be 477, and your health should be 184, giving you a passive damage resistance of 74.9 even if you're just standing still, which increases to 80.8% when you're using your charge attacks, because just like Vosh, I too love doing math. Even if you don't have the Labyrinth gloves, you can still hit the DR cap this way. It's just slightly better when you're not doing the charge attacks. Most of this gear seems self-explanatory, but let's get on with why we're putting everything where we're putting them. The fact is, it's very hard for anything to out-damage the crazy healing, even if the only things you have boosting it are the trade and the perk themselves. The healing might be a bit slower than most of the clips you've seen, but that's okay. We don't need super duper light speed healing, we just need enough, and we already have more than enough. All we actually need is to not get one-shotted, which is why everything else that I have is focused on having the highest total defensive ability. Most of these look self-explanatory, but what about the Drakestone Pearl? What about rerouting cable? What about the shield amount? Well, the idea is that using World's Edge, we're going to constantly spam charged attacks. Vosh mentioned this in his own melee build, but Horizon Strike doesn't actually have a required stamina value, meaning as long as you have at least 1 stamina, you can use the heavy attack and get the full effect, which means the Drakestone Pearl is going to let us use charged attacks infinitely, keeping Steadfast active, therefore keeping us from getting staggered, keeping that nice 80% DR cap active, and finally doing some free damage on top of that. If you've been watching Vosh's videos as well, the point of Song of Aether is to inflict an enemy debuff, making them deal 15% less damage, which is actually calculated separately from DR, and the same goes for Blood Bond. So technically, we're reducing our total damage by upwards of 84.7%, which means at max shields from rerouting cable, which would be 60% of our max HP, we can block a whopping total of 1924 raw damage in our ideal situation without dying. And yet somehow the Roar from a Walker will still one-shot us because this game is stupid. That said, basically everything else is fine, including Venom Spears, so don't worry about dying to basically anything else the game can throw at you. You're not quite as invincible as something like the Infinite Shield exploit that's been going around lately, but at least this one doesn't have a time limit. You can be in the boss for 5 minutes or 2 hours and you'll be just as immortal. But wait a minute, Seagull, aren't you worried about running low on relics eventually? No, usually you don't have to do this, but if you somehow start running low on relics, just damage your summon. You'll regenerate those relics really fast. Just keep refreshing them every like 15 seconds or so. It's better to err on the side of caution with this, but as long as you do that, you're kind of immortal the rest of the time. Like, easy peasy. You don't have to play the game anymore. Congrats, you've solved Remnant 2. Now, let's talk about variants. Now, earlier I mentioned there was a way to use Flail with this build, and I also mentioned there was a way to have this working even better in multiplayer. Let's start with the Flail variant. If we remove the shield amount fragment and replace it with melee charge attack stamina, and then we take Twisted Idol and replace it with Matriarch's Insignia, we give ourselves a combo that will allow us to use our charge attack, well, forever. As long as we're landing the hits, we will always regen enough stamina to keep the attack going, resulting in much more close range DPS than World's Edge is capable of. Just remember to take a break every 15 seconds or so to pop a new relic. But hey, we're not done yet. There's a funny interaction with a weapon mod called Bore. Normally it creates a free weak spot on the target where you get 50% of the normal weak spot damage, but things go a bit differently when melee gets involved. Not only does the weak spot damage not get reduced, it counts as a new hitbox entirely, completely independent of the original enemy hitbox. So if you cast both charges at a boss and then aim your flail at it, you can hit the enemy 3 times per swing, 2 of which are full-on weak spots with full damage, skyrocketing your melee damage output more than like 5-fold, honestly. And sometimes this damage gets so crazy that it allows you to have enough mod power to do it all again. Why aren't we doing this with World's Edge, you ask? Because for that weapon's charged attacks, most of the damage comes from the beam itself, not the weapon. And that beam doesn't interact with Bore at all. Why? I don't know. Game design at its finest. Anyway, so that explains how Flail can fit into this build. But what about multiplayer? Okay, so you're gonna love this. Remember that really useless ring that you needed co-op to reach in Postulant's Parlor called Game Master's Pride? Yeah. In 3-player co-op, it increases shared healing by 50%. Huh? No, Seagull. You must be reading the description wrong. See, here it clearly states that healing is actually reduced by 50%, not increased. Well, that's the funny thing about math, isn't it? So, this is gonna sound super weird, but usually when you do any form of shared healing, most of it is wasted. In a 3-player lobby, 2/3 of it is usually wasted because more often than not, only one person is being damaged at any given time, right? So, in theory, if the damage was shared equally, then no shared healing would be wasted, making the shared healing technically 3 times as strong as it was before, because all of it's being used. Except then, the ring gets reduced by half, meaning the shared healing is now 1.5 times as strong, or 50% stronger. Crazy, right? Now, I did check on this. The 50% reduction is multiplicative, not additive, so having triage does not completely make up for the drawback of the ring by itself. You know what does though? Burden of the Divine. Any solo healing you get is also given to your allies at a rate of 50%. This means that in a 3-player lobby, your team as a whole gets 200% the healing, which completely negates the drawback of Game Master's Pride for solo healing. And since group healing, as we established, is already stronger, that means the only thing left from the ring are the benefits. Oh, but Seagull, what are the benefits? I'm so glad you asked, random person, because you are not just sharing your healing, you're not just sharing your damage, you're sharing both, which means you're sharing your entire health pool on a conceptual level. You don't actually have 184 HP, you have a collective HP of 552, with even faster healing that you were getting solo, especially now that you have more players. The overhealing from Resonating Heart we mentioned in the beginning of the video is going to get even more ridiculous. The only drawback is that there's 3 of them, right? There's 3 hitboxes to consider. This means that you are even more impossible to one-shot as long as you don't all get hit by the same massive attack at the same exact time. All we need to make this work is to replace 2 of our rings, changing out Rerouting Cable and Seal of the Empress with Game Master's Pride and Burden of the Divine. Since we're not using the shield anymore, you can swap the shield amount fragment with healing effectiveness. Now, the reason why we're not using the shield is because Game Master's Pride is bugged. When someone gets hit, you lose both HP and your shield. It's kind of stupid. Regardless though, one person doing all the healing is all you really need, so everyone else just needs health and defense. Then they can go into other archetypes like Engineer for more consistent damage output. I actually did my first Apocalypse campaign with a buddy of mine with an unoptimized version of this setup, and only 2 players. And even an unskilled player like myself was finally able to do it. Mathematically speaking, our builds weren't even finished, and it would have worked even better with 3 players. But we did it anyway, just by ourselves, because that's how strong these interactions come together. This just goes to show that the strongest build the game has to offer is actually friendship. Thanks for watching, everybody. I should have another build video coming soon at some point. See you next time.